So, I want to talk about the Middle East and Iran crisis, and I also will talk about the AI infrastructure build out and sort of focusing on Texas. These are indeed strange and strained times right now, and the economic pain is being felt unequally. So, in the Middle East, first of all, some things that have sort of come to light and are top of mind. One is we know there's supply disruptions, which are still on, and I've written about that on my Substack in a few articles. This conflict is ebbing and flowing. It's off again, on again on peace talks. Two things that were really notable was that Kuwait called force majeure on its trying to meet customer demands recently. Like actually, that was reported on the 20th. That's a big deal. So it just shows that there's real pain being felt in the Gulf states and also for the customers that would be receiving those cargoes. The other item of note is that Kuwait also, no, the UAE requested financial backstopping from the United States. And just also to note is that the UAE has sovereign wealth funds in the United States regarding the AI infrastructure build out, including their own AI infrastructure build out. So this is, adding a wrinkle in some of those plans. Just notable too, Saudi Arabia was investing quite heavily in its digital infrastructure build out as well. And so all those things are going to be impacted some to, lesser and more degrees depending on the supply that's been shut in. And then secondly, I just want to say that, energy security is going to be taking a big rethink and is obviously top of mind. But right now, I think a lot of countries that are importing from the Gulf states are having to, think about what energy security looks like now and in the future, both short-term crisis dealings and then also medium-term, how do we diversify our sources of energy more? And so that's definitely something that's going to be happening. And it still is looking like there's, going to be $100 oil. We are not going to see low gasoline prices in the United States anytime soon. And it's all going to take a while to work through the system as well. And then just two, general things on the AI infrastructure build out in the United States. It's continuing. You see progress being made in some of the large scale projects like Microsoft's Fairfield project. Amazon just announced that they're going to be investing 25 billion in Anthropic. Microsoft is taking over some leases at the Abilene Stargate project and has taken those over from OpenAI, Oracle CoreWeave, and also Meta as well has absorbed some of those leases. And these are really huge capital projects. So, the hyperscalers have definitely benefited in some of these changes, and we're going to probably see a lot of shifting around in the future with different developments. But it's still very much on for now. We don't know what the intensity is going to be going forward. And power is still, kind of keying in the equation. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit and kind of deep dive a little bit more on the Texas scene. I attended a global energy symposium at TCU Energy Institute last week, and I want to sort of do a download of some of the things I heard and just kind of marry that with some of the things I've been writing about too on the Substack and in other places. So now I'm going to talk about the Texas data center scene. I've written quite a bit about it, and I've got some things that I think are sort of noteworthy updates. And much of this is coming from the Energy Symposium that I recently attended at TCU. And some of this is just sort of some of my takeaways after listening to the CEO of ERCOT, which is the Texas grid. He spoke in the symposium, and it was really good to hear some firsthand information that confirms a lot of the headlines. So first of all, he said, you know, all the action with the data center demand, the large load growth and all that is nuts. And he said that the headlines are true. And so that was kind of fun. But also just to know that the grid operator ERCOT is addressing the challenges and trying to accommodate what is going to be true in real demand in the future. And that includes data centers, industrial action, crypto, and oil and gas as well, because they're all heavy users of the grid on the business side. And of course, there's a huge, consumer base as well. And so they're really working hard to try to innovate. And so, some stats just is that, and this was from the power producer side, an executive from a power producer that was there from Vistra said that their estimates are that the Texas grid will be growing from 4 to 5% per annum, maybe 6%, ahead in the years ahead. And PJM is looking like 2 to 3% growth. And Texas is obviously attracting a lot of data center growth for many, many reasons. And I've talked about that in the past as well. But there is a lot of rethinking and recalibration of the grid happening to manage the growth. Um, there needs to be incentives for generation needs going forward and a rethink about that because the Texas market was designed as a deregulated market roughly 25 years ago. And that world in which this market was designed doesn't quite exist in the same state anymore. So there's going to be a lot of, rethinking how to do the grid in the future. And so just some other takeaways. So Texas peak grid is around 85 gigawatts. Now the queue for generation is 450 gigawatts total over the next many years. 360 of that's solar and batteries. 60 of that, 60 gigawatts is gas generation. 50 gigawatts is wind. So that's all the generation that wants to be on the grid. Not that that's all going to happen either. And then there's a lot of innovation on load control, both on the generation side and also the large loads that want to hook up to the grid. So there's two interconnection queues, the ones for generation and the ones for large loads like data centers. And this is from a recent report that I obtained, and this was actually from April 21st, which is like a week after the symposium. And basically, ERCOT asked that the transmission service providers, give them a line of sight of what's being reported in the queue or being requested. And again, this is just to show that there's this high interest on being on the Texas grid. So they noted that there's a 2026 forecast of 98 gigawatts going forward, and of peak demand. And then right now, they're kind of saying it's 112 gigawatts that were reported with interest to be on the Texas grid. So that's, 2026, that's way higher relative to the 85 peak gigawatts that we've been burning recently. And then they also noted that in 2026, data centers alone that were reporting wanting to be on the grid is 7.4 gigawatts. In 27, grows to 40 gigawatts. In 28, almost 100 gigawatts. In 29, 150 gigawatts. In 30, 187 gigawatts. In 31, 212 gigawatts. In 32, 228 gigawatts. Interestingly, crypto is 9 gigawatts in total all the way to 2032. Industry is 3 gigawatts, and oil and gas is 2.5 gigawatts. So obviously, a lot of this demand is data center demand. And I've seen stats that say like, maybe half of that even makes. And even now, we don't even know that half of the half will make. It's really, really hard to say right now. And the other thing that's happening with the ERCOT grid is they're heading towards this process called a batch process, which will help them study this interconnection pipeline to help reduce uncertainty and to get more true numbers of what the forecasts are going to be. And so the goal is that they will be aligning interconnection with transmission planning. And then in the future, they're going to have stricter entry criteria of, who gets in that interconnection queue even. And it's going to be integrated with transmission plans. So also to note, and this is something I wrote about in NAPE magazine, is the plans for Texas building these new 765 kilowatt transmission lines, which are these high voltage transmission lines. And there are not a lot of these miles even in the United States. This with Texas, it's going to cover quite a bit eventually of the state. And so, and one thing to note that they said was that these 765 kV lines are very efficient over long distances. And as we know, in Texas, there's a lot of, it's a big state with a lot of long distances. And so, and some of this is supposed to be originating like in the far west and kind of going through the Permian Basin and some other areas in Texas. And there's also talk about these eastern lines that include more of the triangle, the Texas Triangle, Austin, Houston. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of the speed of what gets built first. And also that what they said was that these lines are 5 times more efficient than the 345 kV lines. So that their carrying capacity for electricity is 5 times what would have been the plan, what would have been had like 2 years ago. And so this has all come to light in the last couple of years, and they're starting on it. And then the other thing that was mentioned too is just how long it takes to build transmission lines. In Texas, it's 5 to 6 years, and in other places, it's 9 to 13 years. And transmission's a big deal going forward, especially with a lot of the large loads and things like that. And so if you want to see a backgrounder on the plan, the 765 Texas plan, and the lines that were already built like over 10 years ago called CREZ lines, which were supposed to help move renewables around, there's a lot of deep detail in that NAPE article. And then the other thing I want to mention too is that everybody's going to benefit from these lines: oil and gas, data centers, and industry. And so it's kind of needed for Texas to keep up with the growth, which, as CEO Vega said of ERCOT, he said, that we have kind of roaring growth that's expected and that is still continuing. So just to kind of wrap it up, I wanted to again mention that the crisis in the Middle East is continuing, and there was also some news that I found a little bit disturbing today. And this was in the Wall Street Journal, and they were noting that there are in fact more attacks in Iraq on Gulf states' interests by militias that are proxies for Iran. And so that is kind of a spread, meaning these attacks are increasingly more diffuse than just the action that's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. And so that's meaningful, and I don't want to downplay the impact of what's happening economically to the Middle East countries and what that means for their customers with oil and gas. And so just in summary, I just want to mention that I don't want to underappreciate what is happening in the global economy because of the Middle East crisis. And right now, the United States has only really bore the brunt to some extent in terms of inflation that's rising and pain at the pump. But if this continues, we will see more competition in projects where projects are going to have to compete to survive. And I think that starts impacting the AI infrastructure build out. If interest rates, are higher, it's going to sort of constrain some of that growth, which may not be a bad thing. We know that power has been one constraint for the AI infrastructure build out that kind of, you know, throttles back the speed of the growth. And so that's one governor. And then the other governor could be what happens with inflation, how it impacts interest rates, how it impacts the consumer, and also just the priority that we would see between, you know, paying for energy versus paying for data. So that's one thing to consider. And when everything's good, we want a lot of data. And it doesn't mean that the digital economy is not growing and that it's not going to continue, but there could be some speed bumps. And so I just wanted to mention that. Thank you for your time.